across Africa, governments are jumping on this new shiny trend, startup acts. Think of them as all-in-one laws meant to make life easier for entrepreneurs. They promise things like tax breaks, easier registration, and in some cases, even access to funding, all bundled into one wonderful package. It started not too long ago. Tunisia kicked things off in 2018, taking a page from Italy's playbook. Then Senegal followed a year later in 2019, and soon after, more countries started saying, hey, we should have one of those. Fast forward to now, and by 2025, 8 African countries, including Nigeria, Ghana, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tunisia, have startup acts in place. Ethiopia is the latest to join, just passing theirs in July of 2025. Others like Kenya, Algeria, Morocco, and a few more are still working on theirs. Some countries are trying other approaches. For example, South Africa doesn't have a startup act yet, but there's a big campaign pushing for one. Algeria, on the other hand, went straight to creating a public startup fund back in 2020 instead of passing a law. But here's the thing that's got everyone talking. A lot of founders say they haven't really felt the impact of the acts yet. The acts look good on paper, but the benefits don't always show up on ground. Hi, I'm Sarah, and welcome to Policy Watch on Business Policy Roundtable. To help us make sense of Africa's Startup Act ecosystem, I'm joined by Omoruyi Edoigiawerie. He's a tech lawyer and founder of E&C Legal, who will walk us through what these startup acts are supposed to do, why so many of them don't live up to the hype, and what can actually be done to make them work for startups across Africa. Stay with us. So I think my first question on that would be, why do you think there is an increasing interest in startup acts in Africa?
Startups are the miners of data, and data is the new oil. And those who mine that data are startups, technology-driven entities. The world is going the way of startups and emerging companies, and two things are very clear. One, you can no longer ignore these innovation-driven entities. 3, we are now in the age of artificial intelligence and the age of technology. And in this age, the key drivers would be startups. The key drivers will be technology-driven businesses and entities. And so it only makes common sense for you to have a law that helps them operate, provides an enabling environment for them to grow and thrive. So if you're taking your technology seriously, if you're taking your growth and development seriously, then you've got to take startups seriously. You've got to take the entities who are going to drive that innovation seriously. So I think that it's the right thing to do. If this was done maybe 10 years before, 15 years before, we would have said, oh, it's the forward-thinking thing to do. But really, any country that's having a startup act now, or a law that's helping grow startups, is really coming late to the party, especially in this part of the world. But like I say, it's better to be late than not to even come at all. The Chinese say the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago. The next best time is now.
So we have established that it is the right thing to do, and it helps to foster an environment in which startups can succeed. So I want to really talk about implementation of these acts. Like we have established, we can write these bills, take them to, pass them into law, and write all these grandiose things that we think will help startups. But if they are not implemented, it doesn't make much of a difference. So how do we measure that these startup acts are really doing what they say they are supposed to do? What are some things that we can look at and say, these are the acts that these countries have put in place for startups to succeed, and these are the things that we have to look out for to show that they are really being implemented and they're really doing what they are supposed to do?
So let me start by saying this, that after a law is enacted, the next most important thing is the political will of the government to implement the provisions of that law. And every law either thrives or dies on the altar of political will. And I think that remains one of the biggest factors that has contributed to the growth of startup laws across the continent, and also led to the infantile challenges that some other laws, some startup laws are also having. Nigeria, for instance, I would say that since from 2022 till now, we have not received the level of political will to enable the kind of growth, right, that the Act envisaged, to enable the kind of support that the Act envisaged, right? So the principal item when it comes to enacting laws, when it comes to implementing enacted laws, is political will. Does government even believe in this law that has been passed? Do the agencies of government that have critical roles to play, are they aligned with the central objective of the Act? And are there clear deliverables outlined and given to every party to do what they ought to do to see to the successful implementation of the provisions of the Act? So let's use Nigeria, for instance, right? Since 2022, we celebrated the enactment in October, and it's just been higgy-haga. And from where I sit, I believe that the predominant challenge is the lack of the central political will to give full effect to the provisions of the Act, to get all the parties involved and get running, right? So I think that that's number one. Secondly, and a distant second, would be the buying of the ecosystem. The end users, the private sector, the founders, civil society groups within the ecosystem, and entities that play pivotal roles within that group, right? But ultimately, if you look at the provisions of the Nigeria Startup Act, it does not have a single bone of legislation, directive or activities that the startups ought to do, so to speak. It's predominantly and heavily hinged on different provisions that provide support, enablement, grants, technology enabled zones, licenses, different enabling provisions. What this means is that there's very little for the startup to do other than to meet the threshold as provided for under the Act to say, okay, do I qualify as a startup? Once I qualify as a startup, the buck passes to government to give me what they have provided for in that Act. Now, that duty to government is scattered across different sectors and different agencies. And so it cuts across various aspects of the governmental supply chain. Now, getting this entire supply chain to align and provide this support for startups remains a critical issue that we still have not really hacked, right? Even putting together the civil society aspect of it, like there's supposed to be a startup consultative forum, a national council on entrepreneurship and digital innovation. Those are still morphing 3 years later. So it still goes back to political will. It still goes back to ensuring that the fragmented aspects of government need to come together to form a solid mold to provide the support that startups will need and give full teeth to the provisions of the Act. And I would think that if you also even look at the Ethiopian startup law, it is an enabling law, right? It's not one that is prescriptive. It's actually enabling, providing support, providing grants. And I would believe that they have mirrored very heavily on the Tunisian Startup Act, the Nigeria Startup Act, Senegalese Startup Act, right? So they have mirrored these acts very closely to come up with something that will also provide an enabling environment and support. Because one key thing that I think that they sought to do was to provide a harmonized regulatory support framework for startups, where albeit was fragmented. And remember that many of these startups are playing in new fields, some even in unregulated fields, some in fields that the regulator has not necessarily envisaged. But they are growing, they are providing some measure of impact. And so they require support in some shape or form. Maybe they require regulation, right? And the duty of the act is to give them the ease, the regulatory ease they need, so that they can be as creative as they want to be, in order to boost the innovation and technological advancement that every society should have at one point or the other.
Off the back of what you said about most of these startup acts being enabling, I think, would you say that the reason why many governments are unable to go into full implementation is because they have gathered all of this high maintenance things and packed them into startup acts, things that they should be doing, and there's no room for startups to actually do anything for the government? Would you say that that's the reason why full implementation is difficult?
Why should startups do something for the government? The law is enabling, right? The law is to enable them grow. Remember that when it comes to prescriptive regulation, there are different laws that provide certain rules that businesses, including startups, must follow. For instance, you have the Finance Act, right? The Finance Act provides certain provisions. Now you have the National Revenue Act, right, which is repealing our previous tax laws that provide a tax framework that businesses, including startups, need to follow. You have the other laws, right? Even as much as the Cybercrime Act, you have the digital code that is provided for by NITDA, right? And pockets of laws that prescribe obligations, right? So there are different laws and that provide different things, right? You have the NITDA Act that's regulating technology. So you have different laws that are providing different rules and regulations that bind businesses, including startups. So the essence of the Startup Act is really not to provide additional regulations, but to enable these fast-growing, technology-driven entities to be able to thrive sustainably and to be able to get the right support they need from government to impactfully provide bespoke solutions to a world that requires a lot of innovation. These are the drivers of innovation, right? So I don't think that that's the challenge. I feel that it is for government to get its act together and get the consensus of all the critical parties that play a pivotal role in helping see the active implementation of the act.
Do you think that startup acts currently, the way they are structured, I mean, with lack of full implementation, and if they were actually fully implemented, would help Africa build investor confidence?
Course.
Do you think they play a role? Yeah.
So labeling is one of the critical components of the Startup Act. Labeling provides a first level recognition from your government saying we can trust this business. And because we can trust this business, because we can vouch for this business, you, an investor, can put your money here. And that's what every startup needs. They need some measure of support. They need a guarantee of some sort. They need the assurance from someone to another person saying, these guys are good. And that's one thing that's lacking in growing and small businesses. They don't have the security to collateralize whatever facilities they need. They don't have the deep pockets to to access all the support that they need. So what remains critically important is the fact that they need somebody to vouch for them. And that's what labeling is. And the idea around for the Nigeria Startup Act, which I'm very well aware of, the central focus for the act in terms of labeling is to give some measure of recognition to startups. And as a result of that labeling, to be able to attract the right investments that they need to build impactfully and grow in this part of in this part of the world, and also attract investment. In fact, there's a provision on the act that investment, capital importation for labeled startups, right, and capital exportation for labeled startups will be duty free, will be interest free, will not be taxed, because it is government's own way of incentivizing the investment in startups, right? So I think that the recognition that the Act provides for startups is one that should help them, and should help them not only access the right funding, but give them the recognition and support across board. So businesses need so many things. You need licenses, you need approvals, you need permits, you need different stuff, right? As a labeled startup, the idea is that with your labeled startup status, you should be able to access these support mechanisms without having the headache or challenge of going through the usual long arduous process. So imagine an agri-tech startup, right? And you have the machinery, you have the technology to develop 10, 20 acres of land, right? But you need a permit, you need a CFO from government, and you're applying for a CFO from government, and you have an investor or a VC that is looking to invest in your agri-tech startup, right? And all you need is to get a CFO for XYZ acre of land so that they can get the assurance of investment. And then it's taking you 2 years, 3 years to get that CFO. No investor is going to wait for you that long, right? But if you are labeled, it is assumed that with your labeling, you should be able to get this approved for you in no time, in 3 months, in 4 months, in maximum of 6 months. You should get that over with. And that is the only way, right, the investor will be able to be comfortable enough to deal with you. That is the mindset, right? That's the thinking. And then to also help budding technology entrepreneurs who are developing unique products, who are looking to build solutions to help grow and scale indigenous technology across the country. And that's why you have, technology zones, 6 geopolitical zones in Nigeria. You have technology parks, you have the enablement of accelerator and incubator hubs, and some form of funding. In fact, the Act provides a guaranteed fund to be warehoused by the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. And the idea is that that fund should be a pool of first level resources for labeled startups. So if you give full life to it, right, it's supposed to be a game changer. Even the Ethiopia startup law, right, provides a $36 billion yearly fund for startups. Money is a critical aspect and critical part of the conversation when it comes to enabling the growth and development of startups, right? And the reason these grants are included in laws, in legislations, is intentional. And the idea is to say to the VC funds, to the angel investors across the world, I'm government, I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I'm staking the little I have on these entities in my own jurisdiction. And I believe that if I can do that after labeling them, you should also be encouraged to invest in them.
My next question is about global best practices. So are there things that, I know that a lot of countries outside of Africa may not have like specific startup acts, but in a lot of them you see that they create like an ecosystem in which startups can survive. So what can African countries learn from this, maybe European countries or North American countries?
Yeah. So I think that First of all, a lot of the culture that permeates through the startup and technology and innovation ecosystem is borrowed. And even the lingo, even I'm sure you've heard about the word safe, right? You've heard about the word safe, simple agreement for future equity, right? And these are all borrowed documents, borrowed cultures from the Western world. The place of divergence is that oftentimes we're only borrowing to appear to be among and not borrowing to learn best practice, and that's a predominant challenge. I, for one, believe in a bespoke approach to issues. What does that mean? What works for us? What is acceptable in this part of the world, right? Given our nuances. And how do we work within these acceptable limits? Does it mean that there aren't things to learn from the Western world? Of course, there are a lot of things to learn from the Western world, right? Accountability, compliance, due diligence, KYCs, data management. These are very critical areas that are taken very seriously, especially in the first world countries, which we need to learn, right? Putting compliance at the heart of what you do, and creating a compliance by design approach in product development, right, and in building your MVP, right, and then looking at data, ethical management of data, and then accountability, corporate governance, right? These are very critical aspects. And if you look at the giants, the big four in the Silicon Valley, what has kept them sustainable and what built them through their formative years were their ability to take corporate governance early, from Meta to Amazon to Microsoft to Apple. Corporate governance was at the core of their early years, right? And so because they integrated sustainable measures leading them to a proper corporate governance framework, today they are, if there's anything, bigger than the biggest, that's what they are as far as tech is concerned. And if you look at even other entities that are growing around those lines, corporate governance is at the forefront of a lot of things. Why do I say this? I say it because a lot of the investments that help propel growth in the ecosystem comes from third-party funding. And one thing that helps keep you accountable, especially to your funders, is your ability to adhere strictly to corporate governance regulations, to adhere to rules, to obey, to keep yourself accountable to other people other than yourself. And this not only helps you with experiential advice, but also keeps you accountable and prevents you from going haywire, right? So I think that we have a couple of things to learn, but I also think that we must again rediscover who we are and do things in a way that contextualizes our local realities and our understanding and nuances. I'll even say to some extent our cultural leanings, right? But there are so many things to learn from the giants, and I think that ethical behavior, corporate governance, ethical management of data, form a key prong of the lessons we can learn from the Western world.
All right, thank you. And my last question is going to feed off your answer right now, which is that we need to take into account our local context and nuances. So what are some examples of things that we can put in place that takes into consideration our local context and nuances?
I'd say our documentation. I just give you an example for a safe. Many startups are leveraging heavily on technology and leveraging very, very dangerously on large language models, helping them navigate some of their compliance and structural challenges, and even today navigate their technology, building apps through these entities. Now, what this does for you is that it does not contextualize your realities as a third world country or as an emerging country. It doesn't contextualize, for instance, your dispute resolution framework. I'm a lawyer, so let me speak from the angle that I'm quite familiar with, right? So where you are using a safe generated for a US market, generated for startups who do not understand the dispute framework or the regulatory uncertainty that we deal with in this part of the world, you find that when such documents come under heavy legal scrutiny, they cave in. Why? Because they were not built for our clients. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say, right? So I've seen founders have agreements, and the agreements has Kentucky, has Wisconsin, has Massachusetts as place of dispute resolution. And for God's sake, you're in Nigeria, you ain't got even a passport. How are you going to get there if something goes wrong? But because it's a template you believe you can afford, you utilized it at that time, and it has come to bite you now. You know, so things are simple as that. Building also products that the people in your locality need, not what your investors are looking to invest in, not what is in their donor thesis. I think a lot of that is improving. You know, I'm seeing considerable improvement in local solutions now being provided for local problems, right? But there's still a lot that needs to be done, right? And for founders, must also begin to build for market sustainability and not build for investor support. And so, if you're building to solve a problem, you shouldn't be tilting heavily to what your investors' donor thesis is. You should actually be looking at building a solution that provides ease to your market and that will help build your numbers within reasonable time.